When people talk about gold in America, the same names appear again and again. California, Alaska, Nevada. These places became legends. Their stories were repeated, simplified, and preserved. Gold there was not just discovered, it was remembered. But gold did not exist only where history chose to look. Across the United States, entire regions found gold without ever becoming famous. No mass migration followed. No mythology took hold. No lasting identity was built around discovery. Before we begin, if you enjoy calm, documentary-style stories about real treasure, forgotten places, and the long-term consequences of history, consider liking the video and subscribing. It quietly supports the continuation of stories like this. This is not a story about the gold rushes everyone remembers. It is about the ones history quietly passed over. According to historical records, gold was discovered in dozens of regions that never entered the national imagination. These places produced metal, labour, and expectation, but never momentum. They did not fail dramatically. They simply never mattered enough to be remembered. The question is not why these regions were forgotten. The question is what happened to places where gold existed, but fame never followed. Gold does not respect narratives. It follows geology, not reputation. In the southern Appalachians, traces of gold appear decades before California's rush. Small-scale mining took place in Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. According to historical records, these regions produced measurable amounts of gold, enough to justify operations, but not enough to transform identity. Further west, scattered discoveries occurred far from established routes. In parts of Idaho, Oregon, and Arizona, gold appeared without the conditions necessary for mass migration. Distance, terrain, and limited infrastructure restricted growth before it could begin. Geography decided more than availability. It determined visibility. Regions close to ports, rail lines, or existing population centres gained attention quickly. Remote regions did not. Without rapid access, gold remained local, extracted slowly, traded quietly, and forgotten easily. Contemporary accounts suggest that many of these areas never experienced a true rush. There was no explosive arrival, no sudden city building. Mining happened incrementally, often by small groups, who stayed only as long as extraction justified effort. Without crowds, there was no story. Without a story, there was no legend. These regions lacked the spectacle that turns discovery into history. They produced gold, but not drama, and without drama, memory faded quickly. What remained was geography stripped of myth, places where gold existed, but never became an identity. In regions that never became famous, the first arrivals were rarely part of a wave. They came individually, quietly, and often without witnesses. According to historical records, many of these early miners were not chasing gold as a dream, but as a calculation. Some had already missed earlier rushes. Others were local farmers, traders, or craftsmen who treated gold as an opportunity rather than a destiny. There were no banners, no announcements, no promise of transformation. Gold was something to be tested, not believed in. In the southern Appalachian regions, early discoveries attracted small groups who worked shallow deposits, riverbeds, and exposed veins. Mining was seasonal, fitted around existing livelihoods rather than replacing them entirely. Gold supplemented income, but rarely redefined it. Further west, similar patterns appeared. In remote parts of Idaho, eastern Oregon, and northern Arizona, gold drew men who had learned caution from earlier booms. They arrived with limited expectations and left just as quietly when returns diminished. This shaped the character of these regions from the beginning. Without mass arrival, there was no urgency to build towns at scale. Temporary camps remained temporary. Infrastructure developed slowly, if at all. According to contemporary accounts, many miners preferred to work alone or in small partnerships, avoiding the competition and speculation that defined famous rushes. The first people did not believe they were founding something lasting. They believed they were passing through. As a result, little effort was made to attract others. There were no exaggerated reports sent east, no promotional newspapers, no deliberate myth-making. Gold existed, but ambition remained restrained. This lack of narrative momentum proved decisive. Without a story that promised more, these regions failed to trigger the second wave, the merchants, investors, and institutions that turn extraction into settlement. The first arrivals took what they could, and when they left, there was little reason for anyone else to replace them. In famous gold regions, discovery was followed by acceleration. People arrived faster than systems could adapt. In forgotten regions, acceleration never came. Gold extraction continued at a measured pace. Yields were modest, but consistent. According to historical records, some of these areas produced gold for decades without ever experiencing dramatic peaks. But steady production does not create attention. Without explosive growth, there was no pressure to expand transportation networks. Railroads bypassed these regions in favor of places with higher population density or political influence. Roads remained rudimentary. Supply chains stayed limited. Contemporary accounts suggest that this absence of acceleration created a self-reinforcing cycle. Without infrastructure, production could not scale. Without scale, infrastructure was never justified. Expectation followed reality downward. Instead of planning towns, people planned exit strategies. Mining claims were worked until they no longer made sense, then quietly abandoned. Equipment was reused, sold, or left behind. There was no moment of collapse because there had been no moment of excess. This absence of drama made decline nearly invisible. Later historical analysis indicates that many of these regions disappeared from public awareness not because they failed, but because nothing notable happened. There was no rise worth recording and no fall worth lamenting. Gold extraction slowed, then stopped, then was forgotten. What remained were landscapes marked lightly by human presence, shallow pits, altered streams, scattered remnants of work that never justified preservation. The regions did not become ghost towns because they never fully became towns at all. They existed in a state between discovery and settlement, long enough to produce value, but not long enough to generate memory. And in that quiet middle ground, history lost interest. In regions that never became famous, the distribution of benefit followed a different pattern. There were profits, but they were narrow. There was work, but it was temporary. There was gold, but it rarely stayed. According to historical records, much of the gold extracted from these forgotten regions did not circulate locally. It moved outward, sold to regional buyers, transported to distant refineries, absorbed into broader markets where its origin was quickly lost. The regions produced value, but they did not retain it. Unlike famous gold towns, these areas lacked the secondary economy that captures profit. Banks, merchants, transport hubs, and land speculation. Without those layers, gold functioned as an extractive output rather than a foundation. Those who benefited most were often invisible in the historical record. Middlemen, who aggregated small yields. Buyers, who controlled pricing due to isolation. Distant institutions that absorbed gold without ever acknowledging its source. Contemporary accounts suggest that local miners understood this imbalance, but accepted it as unavoidable. With no leverage, no competition, and no infrastructure, negotiation was limited. Gold was exchanged for cash, supplies, or credit, often on unfavorable terms. This created a quiet asymmetry. The labor and risk remained local. The profit and permanence moved elsewhere. Over time, This pattern prevented the accumulation necessary for transformation. No capital remained to fund schools, roads, or diversification. Without retained value, regions could not evolve beyond extraction. Gold did not make them wealthy. It made them useful. Once usefulness ended, attention moved on. The regions were not remembered because they had never been invested in deeply enough to matter to anyone beyond the moment of extraction. Fame is often built by institutions, not discoveries. In forgotten gold regions, institutions never arrived in force. According to later historical analysis, the absence of banks, legal infrastructure, and formal governance limited not only growth, but legitimacy. Without recognized systems, these regions existed on the margins of economic planning. Claims were informal, records were incomplete. Ownership was often ambiguous. This uncertainty discouraged long-term commitment. Investors avoided regions where disputes were likely and enforcement was weak. Families avoided places where stability was unclear. Without institutional presence, permanence remained unattractive. Even when gold production justified expansion, the lack of structure prevented momentum. Railroads hesitated. Government attention focused elsewhere. These regions remained operational but peripheral. Contemporary accounts describe a persistent sense of provisional existence. People worked the land as if departure were inevitable. Buildings were temporary. Settlements avoided scale. The absence of institutions shaped psychology as much as economy. When nothing is built to last, people behave accordingly. Maintenance replaces ambition. Preservation replaces planning. The future becomes abstract. This institutional void also affected memory. Without records, archives, or sustained population, there was little to document. Discoveries went unrecorded or were noted briefly before disappearing from public discourse. Gold existed. Work happened, but history left no trace. These regions were not excluded from history by accident. They were excluded because history requires structure to remember, and structure never arrived. History remembers what is repeated. In famous gold regions, stories multiplied faster than facts. Newspapers exaggerated. Letters travelled east. Rumours became invitations. Memory formed almost immediately, reinforced by scale and spectacle. In forgotten gold regions, this process never took place. According to historical records, news of discoveries often remained local. Reports were brief, practical, and unembellished. There was little incentive to dramatise results that promised modest returns and uncertain futures. Without exaggeration, attention faded quickly. Mining in these regions produced no defining moment, no sudden influx, no overcrowded camps, no explosive rise that demanded retelling. Work continued quietly, and quiet work does not generate mythology. Contemporary accounts suggest that even those who participated rarely spoke of these experiences as transformative. Gold was something they encountered, not something that defined them. When asked later, many described the period as temporary labour rather than destiny. This mattered. Myth requires belief that something exceptional occurred. These regions never inspired that belief. Without repetition, memory weakened. Stories were not passed down. Towns did not celebrate anniversaries. No shared narrative emerged to preserve identity once extraction ended. Later historical analysis indicates that once a region fails to establish its own myth early, it rarely develops one later. Memory does not accumulate retroactively. It must be sustained in real time. Gold existed in these places, but meaning did not. And without meaning, history moved on. The forgotten gold regions reveal something essential about how history is constructed. Discovery alone is not enough. Extraction alone is not enough. Even value is not enough. What turns an event into history is visibility, repetition, and institutional reinforcement. These regions lacked all three. Later historical analysis shows that many of the same forces that elevated famous gold rushes actively marginalized quieter ones. Transportation networks, political influence, and media attention concentrated focus on a small number of regions while ignoring others entirely. This selective memory shaped national identity. Gold became associated with a few legendary places, while the broader reality, that gold was scattered widely, unevenly, and often inconsequentially, disappeared from view. These forgotten regions challenge the simplified narrative of American expansion. They show that opportunity did not always lead to transformation, and that discovery often ended without consequence. They also expose a deeper truth. History does not record effort. It records impact. Places that never changed the system were never preserved by it. Their contributions were absorbed quietly, leaving no trace in the national imagination. The absence of fame was not accidental. It was structural. And in that absence, these regions became invisible, not because nothing happened there, but because nothing happened loudly enough to matter to those who write history. They remind us that much of what shaped the country did so without recognition. Gold existed. People worked. Lives were spent. And then the record went silent. Living in a place that history never noticed creates a particular state of mind. In famous gold regions, even failure carried meaning. People could say they had been part of something larger, a rush, a movement, a moment that mattered. Memory softened loss by giving it context. In forgotten gold regions, that context never formed. According to later historical analysis, communities that emerge without recognition often internalize their invisibility. Effort feels temporary. Success feels provisional. The sense that this place matters never fully develops. Gold did not change that. For many miners and families, the experience of extraction became detached from identity. It was work, not history. When gold ended, there was no shared story to hold on to, only the practical memory of labor that had come and gone. This shaped expectations across generations. Children grew up in places with no celebrated past and no promised future. Ambition often pointed outward. Staying became associated with limitation rather than loyalty. Leaving felt inevitable, not rebellious. Contemporary accounts suggest that this psychological pattern reduced the likelihood of reinvention. When people do not believe their place has significance, they are less willing to invest in its transformation. Hope requires visibility. Without it, caution dominates. People plan narrowly. Risk is avoided. The goal becomes stability rather than change. In this way, being overlooked became self-reinforcing. The absence of recognition shaped behavior that ensured continued absence. The regions were not just forgotten by history. They learned to forget themselves. The long-term consequences of forgotten gold regions did not arrive as crises. They arrived as gradual erosion. According to historical records, many of these areas experienced repeated cycles of marginal revival followed by decline. Small industries replaced mining briefly, then faded. Population stabilized at low levels. Infrastructure aged without renewal. Because these regions never collapsed dramatically, they were rarely targeted for intervention. There was no emergency to respond to. No iconic loss to preserve. They existed below the threshold of concern. This lack of closure mattered. In famous gold towns, collapse created an ending. Abandonment marked a boundary between past and present. In forgotten regions, the story never ended. It simply thinned. Later, historical analysis indicates that this absence of resolution made long-term planning difficult. Without a clear identity, either prosperous or preserved, these regions hovered in an ambiguous state. They were not destinations. They were not ruins. They were not priorities. Over time, this ambiguity produced a quiet form of regional stagnation. Investment avoided uncertainty. Policy favoured clarity elsewhere. Generations passed without decisive change. The gold rush had promised transformation. What followed was continuity without direction. These regions did not disappear, but they also did not progress. They became landscapes of unacknowledged effort, places shaped by work that history declined to name. The consequence was not failure. It was invisibility that endured. In the end, what defines these forgotten gold regions is not what they lacked, but what they never received. They had gold. They had labour. They had people willing to stay as long as the ground allowed. What they did not have was amplification. History favours places where events accelerate, where discovery becomes spectacle, where effort becomes story, and where repetition turns coincidence into legend. These regions never crossed that threshold. According to historical records, their gold entered the same markets, the same systems, and the same national economy as gold from famous rushes. It was refined, traded, and absorbed without distinction. Once separated from the ground, its origin no longer mattered. What remained was the place itself, stripped of both gold and recognition. These regions remind us that discovery alone does not guarantee transformation, that work does not ensure memory, and that value can be extracted without ever leaving a mark on identity. They also challenge the idea that history is a complete record. Much of what shaped the country did so quietly, without monuments or anniversaries. Entire regions contributed labour and resources without ever being named in the story that followed. The gold rush narrative remembers success and failure, boom and collapse. It rarely remembers what happened in between. These places existed in that middle ground, productive, functional, and ultimately invisible. They were not legendary enough to celebrate, not tragic enough to mourn, not important enough to preserve. And so they faded, not into ruin, but into obscurity. If gold can exist without creating history, if work can happen without leaving memory, then how much of what shaped the country was never recorded at all?